Professor Davis here, and we are going to dive into part 2 of our diversity of plants. In this particular lecture, we're going to focus in on gymnosperms and angiosperms. All right, so the gymnosperms are the plants that are known as vascular plants. They do have vascular tissue, which allows them to grow up against gravity. But what makes them different than ferns and other plants is the fact that they produce seeds, but their seeds are known as naked seeds. Their seeds have to be made inside of cones. So gymnosperms are the cone-bearing types of plants. So some examples are the cicades. This is going to be a number 1. The ginkgos with the little number 2. We also have the neophytes, which are 3, and then the conifers, which are 4. And conifers are the biggest group. This is the one that you would be mostly familiar with because they're the pine trees, or what we would call the evergreen trees, like the trees we use for Christmas. So if we're taking a look here at this particular phylum, this is going to be focusing more on the evergreens, so the pine trees. And these guys are known to have softer wood, so not like oak and things like that. If you'll notice that pine wood is a little bit softer, and it's going to be softwood trees. This is called the Coniferophyta group. Now, their life cycle does include heterosporangy. Now, before in the other groups, we saw they had homosporangy, meaning the spores are going to be the same no matter what they're going to grow into, either male or female. Okay, we have to have 2 separate ones come together. This particular case, heterosporangy, means that they have to be different. The spores are even different. So what they end up making are microspores. Microspores are produced in the pollen, or what we call the male cone. Okay, and so when we look at this, these are going to be formed in that male cone area, and this is going to be known as the pollen. These are formed by meiosis. They make this through meiosis in the scales of the male cone, and it develops into what we call the microgameophyte. Micro means small, means little, tiny. Okay, so it's the microgameophyte. Now, the pollen is smaller than the egg, so this is why it gets named that. Okay, now when we look at this pollen, the pollen is going to contain 2 non-flagellated sperm. Now, this is the first time we're seeing no flagella, so we are not going to rely on water here. We're going to rely more on wind and pollinators. Okay, and so when we look at this, when an actual fertilization event occurs, because there's 2 sperm in there, one sperm is going to fertilize the actual egg, and that's what's going to make the zygote, the new plant. But the other is going to just disintegrate. So they have a 2-shot system that's ready here. One will ultimately fertilize the egg, the other one just gets removed, okay, in this system. In this particular phylum, because of it having the microspores as being the male parts with the pollen, we also have megaspores, which are going to produce in the seed. These are the female parts, and so they're going to be found in the female cone. So you'll notice the female cone is different in structure. So the male cone is going to be those that have kind of like that. When you touch them, you get the yellow on your hand or the orange on your hand. Those were the male cones. The female cones are the ones that we collect, like pine cones. They're the parts that's harder. Okay, that's the female cones. These are formed by meiosis in the scales of the female cone. So the seeds are formed there. These guys form into the megagameophyte. Now the megagameophyte just means it's larger than the pollen. Okay, it's not huge, it's just larger than the pollen. So this is why it's called the mega or bigger gameophyte. This is found inside of the female structure called the ovule. Now, when we look at this, an ova or egg develops in each ovule. 2 ovules develop on each scale. So each of those little areas that you could like pull off of the pine cone technically contain 2 eggs or 2 types of seeds. Okay, transfer of pollen from the microspores going from the male cone to the megaspores in order to fertilize the egg on the female cone. So this transfer of pollen from the male to the female is known as pollination. Okay, so if we are transferring the pollen from male to female, it's pollination. Now, most of these plants are going to utilize the wind. The wind is going to help them with their pollination. When the actual fusion of the nuclei of the male and female gametes occur, we call this fertilization. Now, in this group of fertilization, we are now, because these are the seed plants, we are now making seeds. Seeds are the mature ovule, and they contain an embryo, which is 2N, diploid. Okay, this is going to then go and divide into the new plant through mitosis. We also see that inside the seed, they package a reserve food source. So they have food packaged in there for it. And it is covered in a seed coat. Okay, this coat helps keep it safe. This embryo, though, is very immature, but it is a sporophyte generation. Okay, it is part of that sporophyte generation. Now, seeds will then germinate, making new plants. When conditions are right, they'll get released. They'll then grow into a new plant. The life cycle of conifers, guys, is really long. It's about 3 years. So pollination occurs, then fertilization, and then the formation of the seed takes 3 years. Okay, we haven't even grown into a plant yet. Okay, it takes a very long time for this process to occur, which is not very efficient, but these are why they call it evergreen plants. They also live for a very long time, right? So the fact that it takes a long time for their offspring to mature isn't really an issue, because that tree is going to live for years and years and years and years, okay? So these are the gymnosperms. The last group, that's the more advanced group of all the plants, are the vascular plants who make seeds that are enclosed in special structures, not cones. Okay, cones are still a special structure, but these are even more advanced. These are known as the angiosperms. The angiosperms also are the flower-bearing plants. Okay, so they are going to produce flowers. The phylum that is going to be really the focus on here is the Anthophyta. Here, there's 2 classes. There's the monocotyledons and the eudicotyledons. These are 2 separate ways of how they end up kind of producing, how they start to grow out of their seeds, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. These are the most populous and most successful group of plants in the world. Okay, they are located everywhere. They do produce flowers, and in these flowers, their seeds are going to develop, and they have structures that mature into what we call fruit. Okay, those special fruit structures are what protects the seeds. Flowers are going to also attract pollinators. These are insects, these are birds, these are animals. Whatever it is going to help with the pollination process. We're not just going to rely on wind here. And the fruit is going to aid in the dispersal of the seeds, because a lot of times the fruit gets eaten by other animals and then they get carried to a far distant area in order then to grow into a new plant. Now, because we have flowers here, we do see that we need to look at the parts of the flower. So if we look here at the parts of the flower, we do see that there is what we call the receptacle. The receptacle is what holds the actual flower to the stem. Okay, so it's the part that holds the flower to the stem structure. We then have the sepals. The sepals are the green parts that look like little leaves underneath the flower, that when the flower is in the bud form, they are protecting the flower. So when the flower blooms, the sepals tend to curl up and go underneath the flower. The petals are the colorful part of the flower. Okay, so those are the kind of outer structures that we see that are present. But a flower also will have male and female parts. So let's talk about the male parts first. The male parts are known as the stamen. The stamen has 2 parts to it. It has what we call the filament, which is the part that holds it to the actual flower. And then the very top part is called the anther. The anther is the part that's going to contain the pollen. Okay, it's the part that contains the pollen. The female part is the center part of the flower. This is going to be called the carpel. Sometimes it's also called the pistil. Okay, so we call it the carpel over here in the words, but it can also be called the pistil. We see that it's composed of 3 parts. So the very topmost part is called the stigma, and it's sticky. That is where the pollen is going to stick. Okay, so the pollen wants to get onto the stigma. We then see there's a tube from the stigma to the ovary, which is called the style. This is where the pollen is going to travel down into the last structure, which is the ovary. Inside the ovary is where you find the ovules or the eggs. And then that is where fertilization is going to occur. All right, so these are the parts of the flower. And we are going to be doing a flower dissection in the lab. So let's take a closer look at the seed. The seed is a matured ovule. It's going to be when fertilization takes place, the sperm has fertilized the egg, and now you have a new baby plant. That's the embryo to it. Inside the seed, we see there is a food reserve, and there's also the seed coat to help protect it. Now, this seed coat is to help protect it against digestion, so that when it's consumed or eaten by an animal, it's not digested in the body. The body cannot digest these things, and it will then leave with the waste of the animal in order to allow the plant to grow somewhere else. The fruit, however, is the matured ovary. This is the part of the female part of the plant that matures, and it becomes either fleshy, like you would see with an apple or a pear or something like that, or it could be dry, like you see with certain kinds of nuts. Now, the whole point here is that these guys are going to aid in dispersal of the species. So fleshy fruits are things like apples, pears, oranges, tomatoes. Dry fruits are going to be more of your cereal grains like wheat, rice, and corn, as well as like pea pods and then maple tree type fruit. Okay, so these are just some examples. And so if you'll take a look, you can see that the seed is inside of the fruit in this first picture. And then we have what we call the dicots and the monocots. These are the two different types of classes we were talking about here. So let's take a little closer look at this, because you'll notice the main thing that's different is that the dicots contain 2 cotyledons, whereas the monocots contain 1. So when we're talking about monocots, okay, mono meaning 1, this is going to be where they have 1 cotyledon. These cotyledons are the little seed leaves. So if you look at the picture here, you can see inside of the seed, there is this one little leaf, one little cotyledon that's going to come out. And so when it busts through the seed cover, you're going to see it's going to come out as one kind of leaf structure coming out. Kind of almost looks like a little stem that's coming out of the seed. These are more of your herbaceous plants. Corn, grasses, and lilies are going to grow in this particular way. So they have one little seed leaf inside of them. But how do you tell if you didn't get to see it actually grow out of the ground? Well, there are ways based on the flower parts where we can see if it is a monocot. We'll get to that in a second. On the eudicots, however, they have 2 cotyledons, 2 little seed leaves. And you can see them here inside of these particular pictures. And so when they come and they bust out of the actual seed, you'll see that they come out and they have the 2 leaves. All right, and they'll be kind of curled like this and they'll come out. These are going to be some herbaceous and woody plants. Lima beans, strawberries, dandelions, and roses are great examples of this. Now, that's not all the examples. Those are just some that I gave for you. So when we look at flower parts on monocots, they come in 3s. So they can be divided by 3. So you'll notice they have 3 petals. They have 6 petals. They have 9 petals. Okay, it's going to be in multiples of 3. On the other hand, your eudicots are going to be in multiples of 4 or 5. So they're going to have 4 petals or 8 petals. They're going to have 5 petals or 10 petals. All right, and so they're going to have more. Another way you can also tell is based on their leaves. If you look at a monocot, the leaves are going to be where the veins run parallel. And we'll talk more about that in a future group when we look at leaves more up close. In eudicots, the leaves are more netted with their veins. So their veins net off of a central area. All right, and so again, that's a way we could look at them to see how they are different. So let's look at the life cycle here of this group, because they are also heterosporangian. They do have the 2 parts, male and female. We have the microspores, which are produced in the male flower part, and we call that the stamen. It is formed by meiosis in the anther of the male stamen, and we do see that it develops pollen grains. These pollen grains are the microgameophytes. Okay, so microgameophytes, again, remember they're small. They also contain 2 non-flagellated sperm. So each pollen grain is going to contain 2 non-flagellated sperm. The megaspores are produced in the female flower part called the carpel or the pistil. We do see that these guys are formed by meiosis in the ovule, and they are the megagameophyte because they're the bigger egg. This ova develops in the ovule of the ovary. So you'll see that ove again. Ova, ovule, ovary. We see that the pollen has to attach to the stigma, travel down the style to be able to access these eggs. Now, because there are 2 sperm in there, this is going to be a unique type of fertilization. We saw the last group had 2 sperm, but only one fertilized and the other disintegrated. This case, both sperm are going to be used. This is known as double fertilization. Double fertilization is super unique to angiosperms. One sperm is going to fuse with the egg, and that's going to create the new plant called the embryo. The other sperm is going to fuse with these structures inside the egg called the polar bodies. These are going to create what we call the endosperm. The endosperm is the food source inside the seed. All right, and so we see one sperm is going to be used to make the new plant. The other sperm is going to be used to make the food source. Okay, that way the seed has its own kind of lunch packed as it gets to start the growing process. Okay, because a lot of times they don't grow right away. You'll also see that once that pollen grain attaches, it creates what we call a pollen tube. Those pollen tubes are going to travel down through the style into the actual area of the ovule, and that's going to be where they will then fertilize the egg. So this is known as double fertilization. So how does the pollen get to the stigma? Well, some plants do what we call self-pollination. Self-pollination is where they pollinate themselves. Other plants are going to rely on what we call cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is going to be where pollen from one plant is going to fertilize and fertilize an egg on a different plant. So it depends on the plant on which way they will go and the route they'll go. But in both cases, they may use pollinators. Now, cross-pollination does allow for more genetic recombination. It gives more gene diversity within plants. So that is the better option. But self-pollination can still help in order to make more plants that are present. So guys, when we talk about pollen specificity, some of these flowers are going to attract certain kinds of pollinators. They'll do this by smells. They'll do this by the type of nectar they produce, like food they produce, in order to then use those pollinators to move their pollen. So I have an example there, videos, again, you can put into the YouTube search bar that are for the orchid wasp or the corpse flower, and their purpose is different. Okay, the orchid wasp actually looks like another wasp, and so the male wasp comes over to try to mate with it, and the pollen gets on there. Whereas the corpse flower has a really bad smell, that's why it's called the corpse flower, and it's going to attract more flies than it is going to attract the other types of insects, not like butterflies or hummingbirds or things like that. And so they are going to have different adaptations in order to also attract and utilize different pollinators. All right, the last little bit we want to talk about are germination. So with germination, this is when the seed actually starts to grow. So dormancy is the time period which no growth occurs in the seed. This would be like when it's sitting in the seed packets at the store, or it's sitting like it just got released from the plant. But germination is when the seed comes out of this dormancy. It must be exposed to specific conditions before it will do this. Okay, so once it realizes that good conditions are present, like moisture, light, the temperature is better, it's going to start the process of growing. So if we take a look here, when we look at the eudicots, we see that their little shoot or their hypocotyl is going to be hooked. When it first comes out of the seed, it's hooked to prevent damage to those two little delicate leaves, and then they're going to then unwind. So they have this hook-like structure. I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. The monocot, on the other hand, has a plume that's enclosed more in a protective sheath, and it's going to then push straight out of the ground. Okay, and so it's going to have a difference in how they're going to grow. So here's the picture. You can see that the monocotyledons are going to be something like corn. You can see that sheath in that tan color that's protecting those little leaf that's being pushed up. And then we start to see that it then blooms out. You'll also notice on these leaves that the veins are parallel to each other. They're all running in the same direction. Whereas in the eudicotyledon, known as the bean here, you can see that it's hooked when it comes out, and then you see those two big leaves that are coming out of that. These leaves also have a vein-like structure that's going to be more like nets. Okay, see how they run in all different types of directions. Okay, you'll also notice their roots are even different, okay, to a point. All right, so this is going to be some of those differences. So guys, let's take all the information that we looked at from video 1 and video 2, and let's do a comparison between mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms, our 4 main groups of plants that we focused in on. So if we take a look here, we can see that we put all this information we've been talking about and we put it now into one chart, okay? So let's look at mosses first. On mosses, do they have vascularity or vascular tissue? Well, the answer is no, they do not. What is their dominant generation? Well, their dominant generation is the gameophyte. How do they disperse their species? How do we get more moss? Well, they're going to do this through through spores. They're going to do this through spores. Do they have actual pollination? No, because they do not create pollen. And their fertilization is water dependent. They have to have water. Okay, so taking information, putting it all into one chart. Let's look at the ferns. Do they have vascularity? Do they have vascular tissue? Yes, they do. What's their dominant generation? Well, their dominant generation is the sporophyte generation. How do they disperse their species? Still by spores. This is why they're known as the vascular seedless plants. So this means they have still no pollination because they don't make pollen, and they are going to still rely on water for fertilization. So they are still water dependent. We then have the gymnosperms. The gymnosperms, yes, they do have vascular tissue. Their dominant generation is also the sporophyte. They are going to disperse their seeds or their species through seeds, but specifically seeds that are considered naked seeds. They're not covered in a fruit. These are found inside of cones. The pollination does take place with the use of wind. And we do see fertilization is water independent. We don't have to rely on water for pollination to occur. The last group is the angiosperms, the most advanced. They do have vascular tissue. They're going to be in the sporophyte generation as well. How they disperse their species is through covered seeds, so seeds that have special coverings around them. They can use pollination through wind or even pollinators themselves, which is how fertilization is going to occur. They do not have to use water, but they can also use pollinators besides just the wind. All right, so this just takes a lot of the information that we covered in part 1 and part 2 and kind of puts it into a chart to help you, kind of condenses the information. But if you have any questions as you go through this information about plants, please let me know.